Welcome, everybody, back to Veil of Sound. We're here with a band that has not been around for decades, but I think that has had quite an impact on our scene. I'm very happy to talk with Simon from Nightmare. Simon, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. First question that we always ask, band merch of the day. Everybody who's watching the video sees it, but for all the people who are just listening to our pod, what are you wearing today?
I am wearing a very old Crowbar long sleeve with the album artwork of their self-titled album. It's pretty ugly, and it's used to be black. It looks more gray now, and it has holes under my armpits. So yeah, it's seen too much, but I still love it.
That's always the case with those things, right? The more they've seen, the more we love them. Before anybody asks,
Yes.
I'm wearing something that I acquired at Roadburn, a Chet Pile shirt. Love
Oh,
the
nice.
show, love the record, and at least something that I can wear to school and nobody notices.
Yeah, they're a great band. I've actually been following for a long time. I think they're really, really, really awesome.
Yeah, they are. Second question. I know where we are catching you, but please tell our listeners or our audience where you are right now.
Right now, I am in St. John's, in the St. John's neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, and I'm sitting in my office, in my label slash any kind of work office.
Is that then also the place where you write your stuff?
Partially. So our second guitarist or other guitarist, Keith, he lives in the area. He lives about 40 minutes south of Portland, and he has a really big studio set up. So when we moved into this house for the first time in well over a decade, I didn't set myself up for recording as much as I used to. And I have a nice open space up here. I'm sitting right under the roof, and I just wanted, after years of staring into big towering studio desks, I wanted to be able to, I don't know, breathe a little and enjoy the space that I have for a change. So I don't have, too much stuff going on here. I just have a simple interface, and I can record ideas if I want to. I'm set up for that, but most of the time I will now just go to Keith's studio to be creative there.
And you've already mentioned that you moved to Portland. I mean, like, I know you moved from Berlin, or at least from Eastern Germany. Why did you move out to Portland?
So first, I lived in Tampa, Florida for a couple of years. And I moved there because that's where my wife lived. So when I got to know her, she lived in Tampa, and after a couple of years of dating, I we decided to get married, and I moved out to Tampa. I hated the climate in Florida. It's disgusting. So yeah, pretty much the moment I touched down in the US, I told her, hey, one day I kind of want to live in the Pacific Northwest, because I had come through here in 2008 on a tour with my old band War from a Harlot's Mouth, and it was like the area in the country that spoke to me immediately. And so yeah, I told her about it. We did a road trip up here in 2018, and she was like, "Yep, I get it. Let's do it." And then in 2021, we were finally able to do it.
So you moved before Tampa won a national championship, an important one at least.
Did I?
I think so. Wasn't it 22 when Brady got his next trophy in the Super Bowl? I forgot. But let's talk about important stuff. I always like to start with an icebreaker, and when I listen to your new record, a lot of associations come up. And so I got two questions for you. What would you rather listen to right now, Sonic Youth or Krellis?
I think Krellis, because they happened to put out a new release on the same day as we did last Friday, May 5th. I already bought it on Bandcamp. I have not had the chance to listen to it yet, but I'm very, very excited to check it out, especially since the teaser for it kind of sounded like John Carpenter synth stuff, and the kind of like the melodies that were played in that little teaser immediately spoke to me, and I was very excited that the album came out just a couple of days after. So I've just been too slammed with the band, honestly, and rehearsing for shows that are coming up this weekend. So I haven't had the time to really dive into anyone else's music, unfortunately, but I bought it and I'm waiting to hear it.
Or other alternative, John Zorn or Def?
I don't know. I love John Zorn. However, I think right now where I'm already kind of stressed out with yeah, it's been a stressful couple of weeks. I don't know if I would have the nerves for John Zorn, but if you would ask me on any other day, maybe I would say John Zorn over Death. Yeah, probably John Zorn, but today maybe Death and kind of penned into the background a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there is some truth to it. I think you can rather put Death as some kind of background music, whereas Zorn always grabs you by the throat and says, "Here I am, listen to me." Yeah, that's
right.
True. Yeah, that's true. But there is some similar effect that your new record has. This grabbing by the throat and a not letting go effect in a very, very positive way. So let's talk about Deformity Adrift. You've already said it. It's been out a few days now. And how have the reactions been so far? Are you happy with the response you got?
Honestly, it's been kind of overwhelming in a way because, this album has been a DIY effort to a degree. I started the label, Total Dissonance Worship, which we're putting it out on in early 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So when you take a risk like that, you definitely don't know what to expect, right? You temper your expectations a little bit when it comes to how many people can I reach with something that doesn't happen in the ecosystem of an established record label. So yeah, with that being said, we didn't really know what to expect. Up until that point, the pre-order did pretty well, or did really well, and the responses for all the singles we put out were great. But when the album hit, for me, it was just kind of like a clean slate, and then luckily it hit like a nuclear bomb somehow. I was shocked, honestly, about the responses, and just the feedback we got from several corners. One thing that happened that really blew me away, or kind of just put me in a really good mood, was when I started my old band, from a Harlot's Mouth, I had a certain range of influences, and bands that influenced that band. And two musicians from bands that influenced my old music reached out to me on Instagram and told me that they really liked the Nightmare album. And it's kind of like a crazy full circle moment, where all of a sudden people that you were influenced by come back 20 years later and and tell you that they like your music, which is nuts. So I don't know, just stuff like that. It was just like a really, really great day. I hate I don't know, quote unquote bragging or anything, but like we ended up really high in the Bandcamp top sellers on that day too, which is on a Bandcamp Friday, which is such a highly competitive day, is not something that you necessarily count on, again, with a more or less DIY release. So yeah, it's just been insane, actually.
Do you feel free to name the two musicians that reached out to you? If not, then that's okay.
I don't know if they would want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's totally fine.
Yeah.
When listening to Deformity Adrift, I had the feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, but I had the feeling as if there were more ambient and industrial elements to the whole sound cascade that is happening around the listener. I'm very, very sure that at least the industrial bit is very intentional. We can talk about the ambient stuff. But why did you incorporate that kind of I don't want to say noise, but that kind of soundscapes and textures into the new songs.
So yeah, the industrial part was very intentional. There were elements of that kind of interwoven with our previous material. On
True.
our first 10-inch EP, the song, what was it, Vessel of Nausea, had kind of like an industrial breakdown kind of part. And on our debut album, there's a song called Tidal Waves of Terror that too has a very industrial kind of breakdowny beat to it that actually our drummer Paul recorded in the studio by hitting like ductwork with a metal pipe, right? So that was actually kind of like live sample, so to speak. So the influence was always there. However, what happened was in the past, our first album took us 3.5 years to write. So I think the result of that was that everything over time, because you overthink everything and you try to perfect everything to maybe beyond the degree that is necessary, right? And what happens is that you homogenize things to a certain degree. You try to really create this like extremely particular vibe and extremely particular sound aesthetic. And so those industrial elements, for example, were more subtle in a way and just like little sprinkles here or there, although we really like messing with that. So the new album was written in 3.5 weeks. And that kind of forced us to be way more obvious with our influences and with these elements we wanted to incorporate in our sound, and industrial was one of them. And so rather than interweaving those sounds over a long period of time, we just put them right in the forefront in certain parts, or in the case of the song Taufbefehl, we just made a whole song that is, based around that.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the soundscapes you brought up, it's just I think sometimes it could feel like songs, especially the songs with the industrial elements, they need something more, like you kind of need to provide some context. Why am I ramping up the industrial percussion, right? The industrial beat, and then it just feels like, okay, this needs more. And luckily we know a lot of very talented people, like Eli from Fawn Limbs. He contributed some soundscapes to Taufbefehl that are really abrasive. And he has several like noise projects, and I have put out one of his projects called Lung Knots that is really, really awesome. And I just knew he was good at exactly the flavors that we needed, to push those elements to the next level. And then I also worked with my friend Jesse Zuretti. He's a composer, like he works for Marvel and comics and stuff like that. But he's a metal guy, and he had at some point just in a message, he was like, if you ever need help with anything, hit me up. And when we worked on Obliterated Shrine, I was just like, this is, the opportunity to work with him and have him come in and provide a lot of more soundscape elements. So, and then even our mixing engineer, Raphael, he already incorporated sound and like impact samples and stuff on our first album. So he actually kind of messes around with sound effects in the mixing stage too. So it's just like an organic process a little bit, where we give people certain freedoms to experiment with certain things.
By the way, if anybody asks who Simon is mentioning when he says the guy who did all the things in the background, Raphael Beauvais from Switzerland, who also did, for me, one of the most important albums of the last decade, Rockal's Heligolabus.
Oh yeah.
Maybe the most extreme doom album ever written.
And it's funny.
Yeah, you go on.
It's funny you bring that up, because I remember when that album came out and I put it on for the first time, and I was insanely impressed by the wall of sound. And I didn't know who Raphael was at the time. I was not aware. I didn't know about him. And it's funny because I talked to him not too long ago about that album, and he was like, "Oh, was one of my earlier things," And like I don't know if he's like super proud of it or whatever, because obviously he's gotten better, quote unquote, over time as a mixing and mastering engineer. But there's like the balance of like raw and wall of sound that he struck with that album, is amazing. And I'm actually waiting right now for a vinyl pressing that just came out through Wolves and Vibrancy Records. I just talked to them yesterday. The record is on the way to Portland right now, so it's cool that you're bringing that one up.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I'm also waiting on my edition, and
Nice.
because we did this huge special here on the repress of Helgolabo. So if anybody wants to find out more about that record, just check our specials. You will find a very, very, very long, it's the longest thing we've ever done. Very, very long special on exactly that record. We spoke to the band, we spoke to Rafael, we also spoke to Fabian, who's now putting it out again. And yeah, there is a lot of content around that album. So if you want to find out more about this, for me and probably also for Simon, groundbreaking album, just check that out. Going back to Deformity Adrift, would you be angered if I said the record is a little less dissonant and a little bit more atmospheric?
No, I wouldn't. I don't know. I don't even know if I agree or disagree, right? Because I don't necessarily, dissonance is not a means to an end for me necessarily, but it's a vehicle to create atmosphere. So if you get a sense of more atmosphere, it's still a mission accomplished for me.
Yeah, it's definitely that. It's definitely for me. When we listened to the record and you said that it was created or written within 3 weeks, then I guess my following question is a little obsolete, but I'll still ask it nonetheless. Is it in a way also a reflection on our times, on the state where we're in, beginning of 2023, when we seem to have less influence than ever?
I wouldn't say so because first of all, most of the album was written in right before the pandemic. And even recorded most of it was right before the pandemic. And then we finished the last elements in early 2022, and then the mixing took some time. So it's so funny because it was so much quicker to write, but then the finishing process and getting everybody on board, getting Velbok to do the vocal feature and all of that, took 3 years. But we also made a decision to not release it during the pandemic, and we did release an EP in the meantime that was part of the same recording session. So with that being said, some of the lyrics were inspired by current things. For example, the lyrics for Hammer of Desolation were written on the day that the war in Ukraine started, and it's just we didn't try to write lyrics about that, but I think some of the themes that were going around the news just made their way into it. People were talking about nuclear war,
Yeah.
And so and it's interesting because the song title Hammer of Desolation, I have dragged that around with me for years, right? It was something.
It's a very good title. It's a very good
Thank you.
title.
It's very on the nose, but that's fun about metal sometimes, right? To be kind of overtly obvious in a way.
Yeah.
So yeah, the title, we dragged that along with us for a long time. We wrote the song, and we knew this is the song that's supposed to be called Hammer of Desolation. Then the lyrics we started writing on the day the war started. So, sometimes things happen, and you don't really have too much control over it. So, and the outside world does seep into what you're doing for sure.
It's funny that you mentioned some of the track titles, because also what struck me is that there are 2 track titles in German, right? So who comes up with the track titles and then who writes the lyrics?
So I often come up with track titles every time I hear something or something inspires me. I make notes, right? And oftentimes like a song title that crosses my mind kind of informs a little bit of what I want to do with the song, right? Hammer of Desolation, obviously it's a song that just really hammers away, you know what I mean? Like the title really fits the song, and that's because the title had a little bit of influence on the songwriting for some reason. It just kind of happened that way. Yesterday, for example, I came across it's like a psychological term. It's called shame spiral. And I thought it was like one of the most intense things that I had ever heard. And, I'm not going to provide too much context, but it's a very, very intense thing, a psychological phenomena. And so the moment I heard it, I was like, okay, I need to write this down. You know what I mean? So it very well may turn into a song on our next release, right? So that's what happens with the song titles. When it comes to the lyrics, for the songs that don't have titles or just working titles that we don't settle on, we usually end up deriving song titles from what happens with the lyrical content. Usually our vocalist John and I almost split the lyrics 50-50. We get together in the same room and we start coming up with a topic that we want to write about, and then we basically do it collaboratively. And on the new album, Keith has, because we did that, we recorded vocals at Keith's studio, so he was also present and contributed some ideas. So it's a very collaborative process actually to write the lyrics sometimes.
So when you come up with a German track title, of course you then have to explain it to John. How does he react when you come up with an idea like Taufbefehl?
It's like I mean, the song titles symbolizes a lot of oppression. It's kind of like religious oppression, you could say, and explaining that it's not a hard sell necessarily, right? And then it sounds, again, not to sound very cliche or whatever, but German titles have a nature of sounding a little bit harsh, like rough around the edges, and it really works with the context. And I could definitely say that song title was partially inspired by one of my very favorite bands, Valborg, and who were also ended up featuring on the song, right? So that whole song had a vision from the start. It was like, I knew the title, I knew what I wanted to do with the song, I knew I wanted at least Christian and ideally even Jan also featuring in the song. And luckily Christian and I are very close, and I've released some of his side project stuff and even did a Valborg vinyl pressing. But yeah, it was just, it wasn't a hard sell, and luckily John is also a big Valborg fan, and that's kind of how it usually goes. I explain the title, it fits within our ecosystem, and yeah, it works out for everyone.
So you've mentioned, that Keith, for example, is pretty pretty close to you, and of course, John, being American, can also not be that far away. But how, in general, is it with a band that is spread out across two continents, as Paul is still living in Germany? How does that work for the band?
So John also moved to Portland the same year as I did. He was supposed to move a year later. He was, kind of trying to do more of a slow exit from New York, but he was born and raised in New York. He has lived in New York, was just a short break for all of his life, and he was ready to kind of for a change of scenery, and he just happens to love this area as well. And then there was extra incentive because it sounded like a great idea for all of us to be in a similar area, to be able to write together. So Paul is the only member at this point who is not living locally, right? And Paul's time is spread pretty thin with the ocean, and the album was written, like I said, in early 2020, late 2019 even. He visited me in Florida at the time for like 2 weeks, and I wrote about 2/3 or a good half of the songs with him, and then I flew out to Oregon to write the rest with Keith in January of 2020. So I would say both Keith and I are good at drum programming. I hate doing it, but we're both good at it. And so we're capable of writing songs without Paul present. And then we give Paul the material, and he is able to contribute his flavors, his own style to it. He kind of works out these arrangements more if we have to do it long distance. But generally speaking, the songwriting now is a bit more personal, a bit more spontaneous, and I like it that way because I stopped enjoying writing songs on the computer which I had to do for a long time when we were all spread across the globe basically. So yeah, it's just different now, and hopefully Paul will be able to come over soon so we can write some new material. We also have a local drummer now who can help us a little bit, so generally speaking, we're in good shape when it comes to songwriting, and it's fundamentally changing right now how we write songs.
But still working with Paul, that of course is also keeping long-time friendships alive, right?
Of course. Absolutely. I mean, Paul and I started playing together in 2006, I think, and I got to know him in 2004 or something. The moment I met Paul and I saw him play, he was in a local Berlin band, and he was immediately like a standout talent to me. And I saw and heard his capabilities, and they tapped into a part of my music taste that I didn't think anyone in Berlin could play. Just straight up, I didn't think anyone in Berlin would be capable of what he was able to play. And at that show, we started talking, and we realized we had a lot of overlapping musical passions. And at that time, we were like, one day we'll start a band together, and then that's what we did. And with War, basically, yeah. So I've known Paul for almost 20 years. Yeah, just shy of 20 years, and yeah, being in a band together and being creative together, we write songs very well together. Also helps maintaining that connection back to Germany, back to Berlin, and helps maintaining the friendship as well.
We have already spoken about Raphael mastering the record and everything. How important is that part of a process for a record like Deformity Adrift? How important is the mastering of a record?
So Raphael does both the mixing and the mastering. And usually I prefer for that to be done by different people, just simply because I like having a fresh set of ears on something. I'm actually a mastering engineer. I started mastering in 2008. And it was basically my main job for many years, and I've shifted a little bit since I started the label. But so I'm usually pretty picky with the mastering. But Raphael's mixing approach is I think he mixes into a mastering chain, and he is just, honestly, he's just like an outstanding talent, and I trust that he can do both really, really well. He's not just making the mix louder, and that's something that I've experienced. Some mixing engineers who also just master it, quote unquote. It's just, okay, now we're pushing the volume, to achieve a standard. For Raphael, the mastering being part of the mixing process is just part of his sound design, and so we trust him 100% to do that for us, and it has worked out just fine so far.
With Deformity Adrift, it has worked out more than fine, my friend. So the record is now out on your own label, on Total Dissonance Worship, and simultaneous also on Vendetta.
Yes.
How did that collaboration come along?
So I've known Stefan from Vendetta Records, as a Berliner. I've known him for also almost 2 decades. And, I remember the earlier days of Vendetta when he was still working out of the back room of the record store, Bischof's Messer. And, that's my favorite record store in Berlin by far. It's like,
it's the best one in Berlin. I like Cortex, but Bischof's Messer is exceptional.
Yeah, just a different. Yeah, Cortex is very, very topical. Like you get punk rock, you get hardcore, and you get a particular kind of metal. You'll find Napalm Death, like you'll find the classics. At Bischof's Messer, you find all the weird shit, not just with metal. It's a more eclectic kind of taste that they cater to. And so for me, it was always the best record store in Berlin, because my musical taste is met with their selection. So, and every time I came in, we would always chat. I would hang out in the back room with him, often chat for an hour or something. So I've just known him for a long time. And when we started planning the album release, I was just like, I can't swing Europe. It's not possible. I can't do it. Right. I don't have any infrastructure over there. I've been away for long enough that it's also, I think, harder to, if we were trying to do it ourselves, you know, I think creating a whole label infrastructure and all the stuff you got to do, PR and marketing and whatnot, it's just too big of a project, you know. Paul would have to take on all of these jobs, but he already has a day job at Pelagic Records, you know, like, so it's just not, yeah, it just wouldn't be possible to do it ourselves. So Stefan was one of the first people I thought about, simply because I know his ethics, the way he runs his label, and him and I always had a great relationship. So, you know, I just hit him up and I was like, hey, you know, this is happening. Would you be interested in doing it? And funny enough, Stefan was never like a big fan of my bands, right? And with this album though, we kind of won him over. You know, but at first he was just like, you know, like he was like, I don't know if it's like the perfect fit for my label, but you know, I'd like to get involved, you know. And over time he really started to appreciate the album and he's really into it now. So that's cool, you know, that's a cool side effect, but it wasn't necessarily like he was hunting after us to get this thing released. You know, I approached him and it was just like, yeah, sure, you know, I could see myself helping out with that. And yeah, luckily it was very fruitful for all of us. I actually think I talked to him yesterday. I think the vinyl is almost sold out. He has like 15 copies left or something, which is also incredible. I didn't know what to expect from Europe, you know, because Europe was always kind of, unfortunately for us, a little bit of an afterthought, especially now that we're more DIY. You know, we just don't have an infrastructure over there. It's as simple as that. And so luckily now we can see the benefits of that as well. And Vendetta are doing a great job. So yeah, it's been nothing but pleasant.
So now we've, I think, covered a lot of ground on the new record, but of course I cannot leave you without also talking about a few of the other things. You have mentioned War from a Harlot's Mouth, one of those bands that, just like you said, were never successful enough in Europe, I think. But was that band for you some kind of like a playground with basically unlimited possibilities? Everything is a go?
I would say so. I mean, I think it was reasonably successful in Europe in the sense that we were able to tour a lot. You know, we did a lot of bigger tours, but also it was a little bit hard because the music was so hard to categorize sometimes for people. That was also hard to find the right tours for us. And we just kind of, our first tour was with Dying Fetus, but then we also toured with bands like Allure, you know, just weird, you know, and that kind of describes the whole dilemma with that band. It was just never really easy to find the right thing necessarily. And then, I mean, sure, I would have preferred to tour with Converge or Dillinger Escape Plan, but getting those kind of tours, you know, you got to have a different kind of pull, you know. And yeah, the band was a playground, you know. The band wasn't super established necessarily in that sense, and almost every album sounded different. So yeah, I think it was a great way to build like a musical language in unorthodox music, you know, and try everything. And then with the last two albums, we started kind of landing on the style more and more that now Nightmare is catering to. Voyeur, especially our final album, I think is pretty, I mean, it's somewhat in line with what we're doing today. I think someone who likes Nightmare could listen to Voyeur and really like it. I would say that much.
Yeah. Whenever I think about Wall of a Harlot's Mouth, from a Harlot's Mouth, it comes to my mind that, you know, I always tell myself, if those guys had come from New York, they would have gotten big. You know, I think also, you know, just like you say, it wasn't easy to put you into any category. And then also, you know, Europe didn't have that much of an infrastructure for that kind of sound. A little too good too early, so to speak. And you have also already been talking about, or we have been talking about, your own label, you know, Total Dissonance Worship, which is now running for 3 years roughly, right? How much of your daytime does the label take?
Almost all of it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's it takes up a lot of time. It's basically a not very well paid full-time job. Let's put it that way, because obviously it's a very underground minded label. And we take a lot of risks. We put out, we'll do short run vinyl pressings of bands that didn't exist, to in the public's eye or ear before. And sometimes that works out really well, sometimes it doesn't, and that's fine. But yeah, it's a very, very time intensive thing. And actually, the new Nightmare album, I think, is release number 100. Um, a couple of the previous releases, catalog numbers, so to speak, in the 90s, are still a work in progress. They haven't come out yet. So, sometimes something takes longer or whatever, and I assign a catalog number. So it's entirely possible that in 6 months from now, TDW 92 comes out, although 100 is already out. But yeah, it's, so to make a long story short, we have a very, very vast catalog, and putting out that much stuff takes time, no matter the format, whether it's digital or cassette tape, the occasional CD, vinyl especially takes time. So it's, it's a very time consuming thing for sure.
So is that also one of the reasons why you have been releasing so much in 21 and 22? In both years, it's more than 20 physical releases. Is that the reason why you do so much?
I mean, I don't know. I think, when we started this, or when I started the label, I almost kind of, the initial idea was for it to just be an imprint to release Nightmare and repress Old War from a Harlot's Mouth Records, right? It wasn't necessarily meant to be a label that puts out other stuff. And then the pandemic hit, and I was sitting there with time on my hands and with this whole concept. And just ironically, I also had a Spotify playlist called Total Dissonance Worship that was relatively successful, had a couple thousand subscribers, and nice, very nice. Love to hear it. So, that I started, on Spotify, it's kind of this thing. Sometimes you think about a band, you type them into Spotify, they're not represented on Spotify. And there are two reasons for that. One is they don't want to, and I respect that. Reason number two is they don't know how to do it themselves, right? Or they don't know, or, it's just not really crossing their mind. And that's kind of what happened in the very early days of Total Dissonance Worship. I would, I just wanted to throw something on that playlist, and then I realized, oh, this isn't represented on Spotify. So I would hit those people up, and I would just be like, hey, do you need help putting this on Spotify? Because I can help. I can get it on there, and I'll, every December of the year, you'll get a check. It's probably small because streaming doesn't pay a lot, but I'll pay you regardless, And so that's kind of how it started. And then in later 2020, I put up my first tape release, and then also started working on vinyl over time. And then I think vinyl started in 2021. So it was just like a process, honestly, that a natural organic process where I just, and then bands hit me up sometimes, and sometimes it's really good. And those are bands like Quadrat, for example, from Greece. That project didn't exist publicly at all. And Ivan sent me an email and was like, hey, I have a band and I like your label and I would like to put it out. And he didn't even have music at the time to show me. And I was like, well, cool, send me something when you got something, and then he sent it to me, and I was really impressed. And we put it out, and the tape sold out during pre-order. It just, sometimes you catch kind of like this little moment in time where right time in the right place. But yeah, it's a very organic process. Between me finding bands, I stumble over Bandcamp pages of incredible albums, and 3 people have bought it, and I'm just like, what the hell is wrong with this? I need to reach out to those people and see if we can do something with it. And I guess 7 out of 10 times you get a response. Some bands are just not active. They don't care. They put it out and then they disappear for years, So it's like, it's a very weird niche with very sometimes very eccentric people, or just people who do things different in general. So yeah, I guess it's not necessarily 100% an answer to your question, but
no,
the
it
best
is.
I can.
It is. It is. It's a wonderful answer. Don't worry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't do too many co-releases with other labels, right?
Yeah, I have worked with Throatrunner Records, for example. We put out Murier, their last album. I was just a big fan of them, and I did license their first album for a tape release from Throatrunner. And I've also known Matthias from Throatrunner since the War from Harlot's Mouth days. I always loved the label. I bought a lot of his very first releases when he just got started. And to work with him was kind of a no-brainer for me. And he's really, really good to work with. And he had also previously so Throatrunner also run Deathwish Europe, and Deathwish Europe was one of the only places you could get some of my releases on vinyl. And that's again because he's great to work with and supportive of the label. So the reason I don't do too many co-releases, I'm open to it. But a lot of the time, I think it would have to make sense in a way where either it's two completely different territories, like with Throatrunner, they're in Europe, I'm in the US. It kind of makes sense to put our resources together and do something together to give the band exposure on both continents, so to speak.
It's like Dunk and A Thousand Arms for post-rock, right? They also do the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, understood. Yeah, I didn't know I didn't know that they did that, but yeah, I think that makes sense. To me, it's I'm curious. Sometimes I see releases. I put out a vinyl by the band Pilori from France, like kind of like a hardcore band with like a discordant edge to it a little bit, and I just really like the album. And I saw that the European release, it looked like it was co-released by like 7 labels or something. I don't know how that would function. I don't know if I could work that way necessarily, but I do like working occasionally with one other label, and bundle those resources. I think everything else would maybe get a bit too complicated. So the US release I just did by myself. It had nothing to do with the other labels that took care of the Euro release. So I don't know how that process works when you have so many different labels involved.
Yeah, sometimes I also see that, especially in hardcore circles, right? Sometimes I have like 8, 9 labels doing something. And the only thing that makes sense to me is that behind all of those labels, there's like a record shop, and they put together money to finance, for example, the pressing. But that's the only way that it makes sense to me. Last question before no, 2 more questions before we come to our infamous quickfire round.
All right.
If you could drop 3, 4, or 5 major influences on your very own kind of writing music or the music that you produced, what influenced you as a musician?
So I would definitely say Gorguts are a big influence on me. Or were. I remember the way I stumbled over Gorguts was kind of like in reverse. I was into a lot of chaotic and like sort of dissonant hardcore stuff again, like Dillinger Escape Plan, and like a metal friend of mine was just like, oh, you should check out Gorguts, like I think you would like Gorguts. It has some of what you're doing just in a more death metal context. And I checked them out and I was blown away by the album Obscura that was recommended to me. So Gorguts, I would have to call them out. Celtic Frost and Triptychon, the last like Monotheist, the final Celtic Frost album. When that came out, again, a friend recommended it to me. I didn't really know what to expect, and that album taught me a lot about heaviness with reduced, like not a lot going on sometimes, yet kind of playing the heaviest riffs, so a lot of my heavy influences come from that direction, and Triptychon, kind of continued that aesthetic. So that would be a big influence for me. Let's see what else. One of my most influential. Oh, it was just 2?
By now it were only 2. Because Celtic
Okay.
Frost and Tipticon counts as one. Don't worry.
Yeah, right. So and then Gorguts. Yeah, Gorguts, Celtic Frost, Triptychon. So one of my main influences, old influences, are ion dissonance. Actually, so ion dissonance informed a lot of my taste when I was in War from a Harlot's Mouth, and they are still relevant to what I'm doing today. Their album Solace, like a mid 2000s, so it's not that old actually. But their album Solace for me is an absolute like reference in dissonant, extreme, low-tuned, unhinged, like maniac music. It's just an insane album, and yeah, the influence of that is timeless to me personally. It still seeps into what I do today. Mayhem is another one, and I
One
always
left.
like Mayhem. Yep. Mayhem. I really like the album Ordo at Cow. We once played a show in Munich with War from a Harlot's Mouth at backstage, and Mayhem were playing the bigger room, and it happened to be on that tour. And after our show, they were just starting, so we ran over and watched them. And it's funny because at the time, the venue was there were maybe 100 people to see Mayhem. It was not a big show, and I know that album was not very popular with Mayhem fans, but it's the weirdest shit they ever put out. Again, it's dissonant. It has the weird production. The show was insane. I also like their older stuff. I like their last album a lot, but that album to me is a huge influence. And so I have one more. Fear Factory. Fear Factory made me want to play guitar.
Which album?
That's all I can. Demanufacture and also.
Ooh, yes, good choice.
Obsolete is also great.
Obsolete is the most atmospheric stuff they ever did. I agree with that.
Yeah,
and I always like to tell that story. If anybody listens and listens to it again, when I grew up with my godfather basically, and I've never seen a 60-year-old man run into anybody else's room and scream like, "I need that record that you took from the car."
Yeah.
Which one? The black one. It's of no use. And he was standing there like, ding, 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 ding. Oh, Fear Factory. Yes.
That's amazing.
That's why I love the guy. Coming back to Ion Dissonance, would that be like a dream release on Total Dissonance Worship for you? A new Ion Dissonance record?
Well, it's funny because I actually had the honor of pressing their first album on vinyl for the first time ever in 2021. And then so I am working currently with the band on 2 more pressings. So one being Solace, which the band fully remixed, and it sounds like a new record, and there's stuff on there that you never even heard in the original mix.
Okay.
Which is, yeah, just because it was a bit messy, right? And I never thought the album didn't sound good, but now that I have heard the new mix, it's definitely a huge step up. So that is honestly since that album is so personal to me, being able to repress that on vinyl and kind of repress it in that like ultimate way, where it sounds better, the vinyl is going to be spectacular. That to me is probably, when I started with the label, I think that's probably as important as something could get to me, and like that's like almost the biggest deal. So I'm glad I can do that with the band, and I'm glad that it's going to be a more enhanced version of the album than people ever heard before. So that's, yeah, when their current bassist remixed it, when he sent me the first remixed song, I almost cried a little bit. I just had a really emotional moment because it dawned on me that this has never sounded so good, and this is probably my key influence for everything, and here I am hearing it in this improved version. yeah, it just kind of, yeah, I was just kind of emotional a little bit when that happened, because I just couldn't believe it, how great it sounded and everything, and being a part of it. So that is happening. We're also going to be pressing their album Cursed for the very first time on vinyl. That was never pressed on vinyl. Would a new album be a big dream to put out? I mean, sure. I've worked with a band before. I would happily put out something new, but I also think they're still under contract with another label as far as new music goes, and they're not very active. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I'm not going to be in a position to put out anything new from them anytime soon.
Is there any other band where you say like doing that would be like a wet dream coming true? Gorguts probably, right?
I was just about to say that Gorguts would be something I would be happy to do. I'm getting somewhat close to that. I don't know if you're familiar with Pellet Veil by any chance. So Pellet Veil was okay. So Pellet Veil was this like all-star collective of band members that was put together for Metal Injection's Slay at Home festival.
Mm-hmm.
It was Luke from Gorguts, Dave from Revocation, Liam from Dillinger Escape Plan, and then Elliot from Carbomb. And they wrote one song together, and the song is phenomenal. And I actually ended up pressing it on vinyl, and it's a single song 7-inch, and I have it in boxes behind me. So at least I got to work with Luke and Dave and Liam and Elliot. They're all great musicians, and it's exciting to do that, but it's just a single song, and we don't know if there's ever going to be more material from that band. That's completely unclear. I feel like maybe not, but I wanted to get that song into the physical realm because it is very, very, very good, and I thought it was a shame that was just on YouTube, basically.
Very good. So let's hit you up with our quickfire bombs. You always get two alternatives, like black versus white, roses versus tulips, AC versus DC, and you have to make a choice and give a short explanation on your choice. Let's start up with a little bit of death metal. Scarcity or Pyron, two of the Doug Moore projects.
I would say, I haven't listened to Scarcity as much. I will say that much.
It's an awesome album.
I have it. I have the record. I have listened to it, and I think it's really good. But I think I don't know. So it's so interesting because evidently I'm into very dissonant music. Microtonal extreme metal doesn't always speak to me in the same way.
Okay.
So yeah, so not always. I think it's great, but I think I like the other one better personally.
Iron. Okay. Sorry. Some weird shit. Mr. Bungle versus some of the Melvins' crazier stuff. What would you choose?
Probably the Melvins. The only reason I'm not like a diehard listener of either. The reason Mr. Bungle gets a little bit too goofy for me sometimes. I'm choosing the Melvins because I've seen them live a couple of times and I always had a great time. So I will say the Melvins.
As you're wearing a Crowbar shirt, two bands somewhat loosely connected to that whole Louisiana swamp metal stuff scene. Down versus Corrosion of Conformity.
I don't know. I'm not heavily into either of them. I'm just gonna say I Had God.
Good way to weasel around it. Okay, cool. You're German, so let's kick off with some German very good stuff. Accept versus Blind Guardian.
Accept. Blind Guardian are a little bit, yeah. I think Blind Guardian are a little bit too it's like a little too much for me sometimes. But again, also not stuff that I listen to a lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know what? I'm also not a huge Accept fan. I don't know, man. Hard to answer.
it's the lesser, the smaller evil, right? That you're choosing. And it will be the same with the next question: Scorpions versus Running Wild.
Scorpions, because I have fond memories of listening to Scorpions in the car on my way to Italy as a kid. And as a kid, when you don't scrutinize music very heavily, you just take it for what it is. You don't overthink it. Driving through the mountains over the Brenner Pass and listening to Scorpions was kind of epic. So that's my answer.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. Yeah. We talked about some kind of industrial sound to the record. Godflesh versus Ministry.
Definitely Godflesh. Harder, darker. Ministry is a little bit, you know, it's like
is
I feel like
that also a little bit too goofy for you at sometimes? I mean, like Jesus Built My Hot Rod.
Yeah, you know, it kind of leans towards like White Zombie, Rob Zombie a little bit too much for me sometimes. You know, it's a little bit too like disco for me almost, you know what I mean? So and in a way, right? So I think yeah, so Godflesh to me is the choice. Definitely a bigger influence on mine. I could also throw in Old Swans, you know, Filth or whatever, which clearly Godflesh are very influenced by. So so I definitely Godflesh, 100%.
I'm very sure that you also listened to your fair share of hardcore back in the day. So let's throw in some New York shit. Sick of It All versus Agnostic Front.
Sick of It All, I like better. Yeah. Just I like the energy better. It's a bit more aggressive.
Yeah.
So I would say Sick of It All.
Before we come to a little bit more dissonance again, let's ask two production-wise questions. What do you rather listen to, cassette or vinyl, or streaming?
Definitely. Well, vinyl is my favorite format, but not necessarily always just for the sound factor. Sometimes I think certain things don't work out as well on vinyl. Like I don't know if I would necessarily buy super clinically produced tech death metal. I don't know if that's something where I'm like, I need vinyl, right? So however, for the sake of convenience, I do stream a lot because the one thing I will say that I like about streaming is, let's say I listen to something here while I'm working in my office and then I have to jump into the car and drive somewhere and get something. Exactly where I left off in my office, my streaming service will pick up in the car and keep playing. So the convenience of streaming is definitely a big factor in my day-to-day music listening habits. But yeah, if I want to sit down and take my time, I listen to vinyl.
We have spoken about mastering. What is your preferred choice for, let's say, an upcoming Nightmare album? Would you rather do it yourself or employ somebody like James Plotkin?
First of all, James Plotkin is local. I just connected with him on Facebook, so just random. I will always choose someone else, especially for albums. The reason being that when you work on a piece of music for so long, and we do most of the recording ourselves, right? And so we already put so much time and effort into the sounds that I feel like at some point you're just burned out on it a little bit. So I would rather give the mastering to someone else, or you know, in the case of Raphael, he does everything in one step, and we know it's going to be good. But yeah, I have mastered stuff of ours in the past, but it's only like releases with 2 or 3 songs. I'm willing to do that, but like major releases, albums, I don't want to touch that.
Before anybody asks who is James Plotkin, again, look at our website. You will find something. Something local for you as well. Maybe not both of them death metal, but really, really good metal. Mismor versus Chornobog.
I like Chornobog more. Speaks more to my musical preferences, and I think that's all I could really say to that. Yeah,
that's already okay. And last question, when you're done. I think I already know the answer to that one, but let's try. Frontiera versus Car Bomb.
Oof, that's actually very hard to answer. And I don't know if I could pick one. If I had to make a choice, it would not be a musical one. The choice would be Frontiera for the reason that I'm very, very good friends with Pedram. Pedram has been really he's been like a motivating factor for me in different scenarios, right? Sometimes we would just talk about music, talk about being in bands, doing certain things with our bands, and he would just kind of kick my ass and be like, you should do this, just do it, work. So it's like, yeah, he would just like give some sort of advice and vice versa, you know what I mean? But like, I just found myself inspired or motivated by things he has said to me. And also, to give credit where credit is due, Total Distance Worship, 99% of our digital releases are available for Name Your Price on Bandcamp. And the reason for that is A, Pedram or Frontiera, and B, Brendan from Convulsing, who played bass on our new album. Both projects have offered their stuff for Name Your Price from the get-go. And at some point I just contacted them and asked them about it. I was like, hey, how did that go for you? What's your experience? How much are people willing to pay? And both of them were nice enough to actually share the actual numbers with me, which was very impressive in both cases, and gave me great insight into kind of what happens when you give people a choice, and I think the simple answer to that is, if you force someone to buy a digital album for $10, some people just don't want to do that, and I understand that. That's a lot of money for something you could stream along with the history of music on Spotify for the same money. And some people are just not able to. Not everyone can afford to throw $10 at a digital download. However, if you give them a choice, even if they don't have money, maybe like, you know what, I have $3 and I'll throw $3 at this album. And I can say that my digital sales, and that goes for Nightmare and for Total Distance Worship, have gone up ever since we switched to Name Your Price, and significantly. Like, we used to sell physical releases fine, but no one would touch the digital. Ever since it's been Name Your Price, people are actually incentivized to spend money on the digital too. So I have those two people to thank for that. And so if I had to make a choice, it would be a purely personal one, and I would give Frontiera the thumbs up. Musically speaking, they're both phenomenal.
True. So, Simon, thanks for all the wonderful insight. Thanks for your choices. Thanks for your time. And thanks for the new record. It's definitely mind-blowingly good. It came to me as a surprise. I've listened to the stuff before. I liked the stuff before. But this, I have to say it again, this is top-notch. So everybody, if you haven't listened to it yet, listen to this album. It might end up in a lot, or it will end up in a lot of people's lists at the end of the year. Simon, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the words about our album. I appreciate that.
Really, really nice. So enjoy the rest of your day, man.
You as well. Well, enjoy the rest of your night, I should say.
Thanks.